Some loves are worth waiting for, even when the world tells you they're impossible. Sometimes the heart sees what it needs, long before the mind understands why. At 16, Grace fell for David Carter, a single father who treated her with the kind of respect most adults never showed her. When she told him how she felt, he gently said, "Come back when you're older." She thought it was rejection, but David remembered every word she spoke, every smile she gave, every moment that showed him a heart too good for this world. Years passed. Grace grew up and moved away. David raised his daughter alone, never remarrying, never forgetting. Then one autumn evening she returned, no longer a girl with a crush, but a woman who knew her own heart. David wasn't sure he deserved a love like hers. But maybe some promises are meant to be kept, no matter how long you have to wait. What happens when two hearts finally get their second chance? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Grace Taylor had always been different from other girls her age. At 16, while her classmates gossiped about which boy asked whom to homecoming, Grace found herself drawn to Saturday morning baseball games at Riverside Park. Not for the teenage players fumbling through their first seasons, but for the quiet man who coached them with endless patience. David Carter stood apart from the other parents. Where they shouted instructions from aluminum bleachers, he knelt in the dirt beside struggling players, his voice never rising above a gentle murmur. His work boots were scuffed and worn, the leather cracked from long hours at the construction site. But his hands were gentle when he adjusted a child's grip on the bat or showed them how to properly field a ground ball. "I don't understand your fascination with that poor man," Grace's mother, Patricia, had said more than once, her lips pursing in the way they did when she disapproved of something. Patricia Taylor ran the town's most successful real estate agency and had very definite ideas about appropriate social circles. David Carter, with his second-hand truck and apartment above the hardware store, didn't fit into any of them. But Grace saw something her mother missed. She saw the way David's eyes lit up when 8-year-old Tommy Martinez finally connected with a pitch after weeks of striking out. She noticed how he always arrived early to set up equipment, staying late to clean up, never asking for recognition or thanks. Most of all, she observed the fierce, protective love he had for his daughter Emma, a love that radiated from him even during the most chaotic moments of Little League practice. Emma Carter was 7 years old, all knobby knees and missing teeth, with her father's dark hair and serious brown eyes. She tagged along to every practice, sometimes helping collect scattered baseballs, sometimes sitting cross-legged in the grass with a coloring book. Grace had first approached Emma, not David, offering to help with homework while the boys practiced. "My daddy says you're the smartest girl in the whole school," Emma had announced one afternoon, her gap-toothed grin making Grace's heart flutter in a way she didn't quite understand. It was the first indication that David Carter noticed her at all. Grace's own family life felt sterile by comparison. The Taylor house sat on Maple Street's most prestigious corner, all white columns and perfectly manicured lawns. Her father, Robert, was a successful attorney who worked late most evenings, and her mother filled her days with charity committees and social obligations. They were good people, Grace knew, but their affection felt measured, conditional, tied to her achievements and behavior. David's love for Emma was something entirely different. Grace watched him braid his daughter's hair before school, his large hands surprisingly deft with the tiny elastics. She saw him arrive at parent-teacher conferences, still dirty from work, apologizing to Mrs. Henderson for his appearance, but never missing a single meeting. When Emma fell off her bike and scraped her knee, David dropped everything to rush to her side, his face pale with worry over what most parents would consider a minor injury. The contrast was striking. Where Grace's parents discussed her college prospects over formal dinners, David and Emma shared boxed macaroni and cheese while working on multiplication tables at their small kitchen table. Where the Taylor family attended church for appearances, David and Emma went to find community, sitting in the back pew in their best and only Sunday clothes. Grace began volunteering at the baseball games under the pretense of earning community service hours for her college applications. In reality, she treasured those Saturday mornings more than any social event or academic achievement. She helped David organize equipment, kept statistics in the scorebook, and gradually became part of the rhythm of the team. "You don't have to do this," David had said during her third week of volunteering, his brown eyes searching her face with a gentleness that made her stomach flip. "I know you've got better things to do than watch a bunch of kids strike out." "I like it here," Grace had replied, surprised by her own honesty. "It feels real." David had nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant, and something shifted between them in that moment. Not romantic. Grace realized now that David had been far too honorable for that, but an acknowledgement of shared values, of seeing the world through similar eyes. The other parents began to rely on Grace's presence. She remembered phone numbers, organized carpool schedules, and somehow managed to smooth over the inevitable conflicts that arose when competitive parents mixed with children's sports. More than once she caught David watching her handle a difficult situation with a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're going to make someone very happy someday," he'd said, after she'd diplomatically resolved a dispute between two fathers about playing time. The words had been casual, throwaway, but Grace had treasured them like precious stones. David worked 3 jobs to support Emma: construction during the day, stocking shelves at the grocery store 2 evenings a week, and weekend shifts at the auto parts store. Grace learned this not from David himself, who never complained or spoke of his struggles, but from overheard conversations and careful observation. She noticed the way he counted bills before buying Emma's school supplies, how he wore the same 3 shirts in rotation, how he declined invitations to team dinners because something had come up. Emma never seemed to notice their financial constraints. David had a gift for making small things feel special. A picnic in the park became an adventure. A dollar store toy became a treasure. When Emma lost a tooth, David left not money but a hand-drawn picture of the tooth fairy with a note praising Emma's bravery. Grace's own privileged life began to feel hollow by comparison. Her bedroom was larger than David and Emma's entire living space, but she found herself envying Emma's bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancake traditions. The Taylor family had everything money could buy, but they seemed to have forgotten how to simply enjoy each other's company. It was during this time that Grace began leaving small gifts, nothing expensive or obvious, that would have embarrassed David and raised questions she wasn't ready to answer. Instead, she slipped a pack of new baseballs into the equipment bag when old ones were lost. She anonymously paid Emma's registration fee for the summer reading program at the library. When David's truck needed repairs, Grace convinced her father's mechanic to provide a discount, claiming it was for a friend of the family. David never knew the source of these small kindnesses, but Grace saw how they eased his burden, how they allowed him to breathe a little easier. She was 16 years old and had discovered the profound joy of loving someone enough to want their happiness more than your own recognition. The baseball season stretched through spring and into early summer. Grace's classmates made plans for beach trips and summer jobs, but she couldn't imagine missing those Saturday mornings at Riverside Park. She watched David teach patience to impatient children, show kindness to frustrated parents, and demonstrate that strength wasn't about raising your voice or demanding respect. It was about showing up, day after day, and doing what needed to be done. By midsummer, Grace had admitted to herself what she'd been trying to deny for months. She was in love with David Carter. Not the silly, dramatic love of teenage movies, but something deeper and more enduring. She loved his gentleness and his strength, his dedication to Emma, and his quiet dignity in the face of hardship. She loved the way he saw the best in everyone, including her. The realization terrified her. At 16, she was old enough to understand that her feelings were inappropriate, that the 11-year age difference made any relationship impossible. She was also wise enough to recognize that what she felt wasn't going away. This wasn't a crush that would fade with the end of summer or the beginning of a new school year. David Carter had shown her what real love looked like, and Grace Taylor knew she would never be satisfied with anything less. The final game of the season fell on a crisp September afternoon, the kind of day when autumn first whispers its arrival through golden leaves and cooler air. Grace had spent the morning helping David organize equipment one last time, arranging baseballs and bats with the careful precision that had become second nature over the months. As the last parent collected their child and the field emptied, Grace found herself alone with David for the first time all season. Emma had gone home with her best friend's family for a sleepover, leaving the park unusually quiet. David was loading the equipment bag into his truck, his movements deliberate and unhurried as always. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached him, a folded piece of paper trembling in her hand. She had written and rewritten the letter dozens of times, each draft an attempt to capture feelings that felt too large for words. In the end, she had settled on something simple and honest, though she couldn't bring herself to give it to him now. "David," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned, those kind brown eyes focusing on her with the same attention he gave to everything, complete and genuine. "Everything okay, Grace?" The question nearly undid her resolve. How could she explain that everything was both perfectly right and completely wrong? That standing here with him felt like the most natural thing in the world, while knowing it was impossible made her chest ache with a pain she'd never experienced. "I need to tell you something," she managed, stuffing the letter deeper into her pocket. The words would have to be enough. David closed the truck's tailgate and leaned against it, giving her his full attention. The setting sun caught the silver threads that had begun appearing at his temples, making him look distinguished rather than old. At 27, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to rely on his own strength. "I'm listening," he said gently. Grace had rehearsed this moment countless times, but now that it was here, her carefully planned words scattered like leaves in the wind. Instead, she found herself speaking from her heart. "Raw and unfiltered. I know this is going to sound crazy, and I know you probably think of me as just a kid, but I need you to know how I feel." She took a shaky breath. "I'm in love with you, David. Not some silly crush, real love. The kind that changes everything about how you see the world." David's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Not shock or disgust, as Grace had feared, but a deep sadness that made her stomach drop. "Grace," he said softly, pushing himself away from the truck to face her fully. "You're 16 years old." "I know how old I am," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "But that doesn't change how I feel. I see how you are with Emma, how you treat everyone with such kindness. I see how hard you work and how you never complain. I see a man who deserves to be loved completely, and I—" "Stop." The word was gentle but firm. David stepped closer, his expression pained. "Grace, you don't understand what you're saying." "I understand perfectly," she insisted, tears beginning to blur her vision. "I understand that you're good and decent, and that you've never looked at me the way other men do. You see me as a person, not just some pretty face or social status. That matters to me more than you could possibly know." David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Grace had seen him make when he was trying to solve a particularly difficult problem. "You're right about one thing," he said finally. "I do see you as a person, a remarkable young woman with a bright future ahead of her. But that's exactly why this conversation can't happen." "Why?" Grace asked, though she already knew the answer. "Because you are 16 and I am 27. Because you're about to graduate high school and start college. Because you have your whole life ahead of you, and I'm a single father barely making ends meet." His voice was patient but firm. "Because I care about you too much to let you make a mistake that could hurt your future." Grace felt the tears spill over, hot against her cheeks in the cool air. "It's not a mistake. It's the most real thing I've ever felt." David's expression softened, and for a moment Grace thought she saw something vulnerable in his eyes. He reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek, the gesture so tender that it made her breath catch. "Grace," he said, his voice barely audible. "Come back when you're older, when you've lived a little more, seen more of the world. If you still feel the same way then, we'll talk." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had expected rejection, but this felt like hope wrapped in heartbreak. "What do you mean?" "I mean that feelings this strong don't usually disappear overnight," David said, his hand still resting against her cheek. "And I mean that I think you're extraordinary. But right now, the best thing I can do for you is ask you to wait." Grace stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "You're not saying no?" "I'm saying not now," David replied, dropping his hand and stepping back. "I'm saying that if what you feel is real, it will still be real when you're old enough to make this choice with full understanding of what it means." Grace felt something break inside her chest, a pain so sharp it made her gasp. She had prepared herself for rejection, but this careful non-rejection felt worse somehow. It left her suspended between hope and heartbreak, unsure of which way to fall. "How long?" she whispered. David was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. "I don't know," he said finally. "That's not for me to decide." Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She turned to leave, but David's voice stopped her. "Grace." She looked back, and his expression was gentler than she'd ever seen it. "Thank you for trusting me enough to tell me the truth. That took real courage." She managed a watery smile. "Will things be different now? Between us, I mean." "No," David said firmly. "You're still Emma's favorite homework helper, and I still need someone who actually knows how to keep a proper scorebook. Nothing has to change unless you want it to." But everything had changed, and they both knew it. Grace walked home that evening, carrying the weight of her confession and David's careful response. She had expected to feel relieved after finally speaking her truth, but instead she felt hollow, like something essential had been carved out of her chest. That night, she sat at her desk with the letter she had never given him, reading her own words over and over. In the end, she folded it carefully and placed it in the bottom drawer of her jewelry box, beneath her grandmother's pearls and the other treasures of her 16-year-old life. She wouldn't know for years that David went home that night and sat in his truck for an hour, staring at the apartment windows and wrestling with feelings he had no right to have. She wouldn't know that he had seen her as more than just a remarkable young woman for months, or that her confession had forced him to confront the dangerous territory his heart had been wandering into. All Grace knew was that David Carter had asked her to wait, and despite the pain of it, she found herself willing to try. Grace's senior year of high school passed in a strange haze of normalcy, punctuated by moments of acute awareness that her life had fundamentally shifted. She threw herself into her studies with renewed intensity, as if academic achievement could somehow fill the hollow space that David's gentle rejection had carved. Out inside her chest, the college acceptance letter from Northwestern arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. The thick envelope, a testament to years of hard work and careful planning. Grace stared at the embossed letterhead, feeling none of the excitement she had expected. Northwestern had been her dream school since sophomore year, a prestigious journalism program that would launch her toward the career in investigative reporting she had always envisioned. "Congratulations, sweetheart," her father said, reading over her shoulder at the breakfast table. "Northwestern is an excellent choice. We're very proud of you." Her mother beamed, already planning the social announcements that would cement Grace's achievement in the community's collective memory. "The Hendersons will be so impressed. Their daughter only got into state." Grace managed the appropriate responses, but her heart wasn't in the celebration. Northwestern felt impossibly far from Riverside Park and Saturday morning baseball games. It felt far from David. She had avoided the baseball field since that September evening, finding excuses whenever Emma asked why she didn't come around anymore. The avoidance was self-preservation, she told herself, though it felt more like cowardice. How could she face David knowing that her feelings hadn't diminished at all, that if anything, they had grown stronger with distance? Through carefully casual conversations with mutual acquaintances, Grace learned fragments of David's life. He had picked up additional hours at the construction company, working toward a promotion that would provide better insurance coverage for Emma. The little girl was thriving in second grade, her teacher reporting to anyone who would listen about the supportive home environment that produced such a confident, caring child. Grace also learned, through Emma's occasional visits to the library where Grace volunteered, that David had been asked out by Sarah Mitchell, the young librarian who had recently moved to town. Emma mentioned it with the casual indifference of a 7-year-old who found adult relationships generally incomprehensible. "Daddy said she seems very nice, but he's too busy right now," Emma had reported while Grace helped her select picture books. "He said maybe when I'm older and don't need him so much." Grace had smiled and made appropriate comments, while something twisted painfully in her stomach. Sarah Mitchell was lovely, closer to David's age, established in her career, the kind of woman who made sense as a partner for a single father. Grace wondered if David's polite deflection had anything to do with their conversation that evening in September, or if she was simply reading meaning into coincidence. The spring months brought a parade of senior year milestones. Prom planning consumed her classmates, though Grace declined several invitations from well-meaning boys who couldn't understand her lack of enthusiasm. How could she explain that she had been ruined for teenage romance, that she had glimpsed something deeper and more meaningful than corsages and awkward dancing in school gymnasiums? Instead, she focused on her volunteer work and her college preparations. Northwestern had offered her a partial scholarship based on her academic record, but the remaining costs were substantial. Grace spent hours researching additional scholarships and grants, determined to minimize the financial burden on her parents. Despite their assurances that they could manage the expense, it was during one of these late-night research sessions that she stumbled across information about Emma's school district. Budget cuts had eliminated funding for several programs, including the after-school tutoring that Emma relied on for help with her increasingly challenging coursework. Grace learned this not from Emma herself, but from a school board meeting notice buried in the local newspaper's website. The next day, Grace found herself walking toward David's apartment for the first time since September. Her palms were sweaty despite the cool spring air, and she had rehearsed her offer so many times that the words felt mechanical in her mind. David answered the door in his work clothes, his face registering surprise that quickly shifted to something more guarded. "Grace," he said, and her name in his voice made her chest tighten with remembered longing. "I heard about the tutoring program being cut," she said quickly, before she could lose her nerve. "I wanted to offer to help Emma with her homework. No cost, obviously. Just I know how important her education is to you, and I have the time before I leave for college." David studied her face for a long moment, and Grace wondered what he saw there. Did he recognize the careful distance she was trying to maintain? Could he tell that simply standing on his doorstep was taking every ounce of self-control she possessed? "That's very generous," he said finally. "But I don't think that's a good idea." The rejection stung, even though Grace had expected it. "It's just homework help," she said, hating the defensive note that crept into her voice. This isn't about anything else, isn't it?" David asked gently, and Grace felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack. "Maybe partly," she admitted, "but mostly it's about Emma. She's a good kid, and she deserves every opportunity to succeed. You know I care about her." "I do know that," David said, his expression softening slightly. "And I appreciate the offer. But Grace, we both know this isn't just about homework." Grace felt tears threaten and blinked them back furiously. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, wouldn't make this harder for either of them than it already was. "I miss her," she said quietly. "I miss both of you. But I understand if you think it's better this way." David was quiet for so long that Grace began to wonder if he had decided to end the conversation. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Emma misses you too," he said. "She asks about you sometimes. Why you don't come to the library story time anymore. Why you stopped helping with her math homework. What do you tell her?" that people's lives change and sometimes even good friends grow apart. David's eyes met hers. I tell her that doesn't mean the friendship wasn't real or important. Grace nodded, understanding the subtext. David was telling her as gently as possible that their friendship, whatever it had been, was a closed chapter, that clinging to it would only cause more pain for everyone involved. I should go, she said, taking a step backward. I just wanted to make the offer. If you change your mind, Grace, David's voice stopped her retreat. For what it's worth, I think Northwestern is lucky to have you. You're going to do great things. The kindness in his voice nearly broke her resolve entirely. Grace managed a smile that felt like it might shatter her face. Thank you. Take care of yourself, David. And tell Emma I said congratulations on her science fair project. She walked away before he could respond. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall until she was safely out of sight. Behind her, she heard the soft click of David's door closing, the sound as final as a period at the end of a sentence. That night, Grace lay in bed staring at the Northwestern acceptance letter taped to her bulletin board. Chicago suddenly felt like exactly the right distance, far enough to start over, close enough to remember that some kinds of love were worth the pain they caused. Northwestern University sprawled before Grace like a promise of reinvention. The Gothic Revival buildings and expansive lakefront campus represented everything she had worked toward. Yet as she stood in her dorm room that first September morning, unpacking boxes that contained the remnants of her small-town life, she felt more displaced than liberated. Her roommate, Jessica, was a bubbly pre-med student from California who had never experienced a Midwest winter and approached college with the enthusiasm of someone attending an extended summer camp. Grace envied Jessica's uncomplicated excitement, her ability to view Northwestern as the beginning of adventure rather than an escape from complicated feelings. So tell me about your hometown, Jessica said, bouncing on her bed while Grace arranged her few photographs on the desk. Was it one of those places where everyone knows everyone's business? Grace paused, holding the team photograph from David's last baseball season. She had almost left it at home, but at the last moment had slipped it between the pages of her journalism textbook. Now she found herself staring at David's image. He stood behind the small players, his hand resting protectively on Emma's shoulder, his smile genuine and unguarded. Pretty much, Grace replied, placing the photograph face down in her desk drawer. Small-town life has its charms and its limitations. College proved to be both easier and harder than Grace had anticipated. Academically, she thrived. Her professors praised her writing ability and her instinct for finding the human story within larger issues. She joined the campus newspaper and quickly established herself as a reliable reporter with a talent for getting people to reveal more than they intended. Socially, however, Grace felt like she was watching her peers through glass. The other freshmen threw themselves into college life with abandon, joining sororities, attending parties, dating with the casual enthusiasm of people who viewed romance as recreation rather than revelation. Grace participated when required, but her heart remained stubbornly elsewhere. She dated occasionally, accepting invitations from classmates who were drawn to her combination of intelligence and reserve. Marcus, a junior studying political science, took her to dinner at upscale restaurants and spoke passionately about his plans to attend law school and eventually run for office. Alex, a fellow journalism major, shared her love of investigative reporting and her commitment to social justice. Both were good men, kind, intelligent, ambitious. Both were age-appropriate choices who would have made her parents proud and her future secure. But when Marcus kissed her after their third date, Grace felt nothing beyond pleasant companionship. When Alex took her hand during a movie, she found herself comparing his smooth palm to the memory of David's work-roughened fingers. The comparison felt unfair to everyone involved. How could college boys compete with a memory that had been idealized by distance and time? Grace began to wonder if David's gentle rejection had been less about her age and more about saving her from a lifetime of measuring every relationship. Against an impossible standard, letters from home arrived weekly, filled with news of graduations and engagements, business openings, and seasonal changes. Grace's mother wrote about the real estate market and local politics. Her father shared updates about his legal practice and asked about her classes. Neither mentioned David directly, but Grace read between the lines of casual references to community events and baseball seasons. It was Emma who provided the most direct connection to David's life. The little girl had learned to write during second grade and had begun sending Grace carefully composed letters decorated with crayon drawings. Emma's correspondence was innocent and loving, filled with details about school projects and new books. But Grace treasured every word. "Daddy got a promotion at work," Emma wrote in her careful block letters. "He says we might be able to move to a real house with a yard where I can have a dog. I want to name it Baseball because that's my favorite sport. Do you think that's a good name for a dog?" Grace smiled despite the ache in her chest. David's financial situation was improving, which meant his careful planning and hard work were paying off. She was genuinely happy for his success, even as she wondered whether the promotion would make him more appealing to women like Sarah Mitchell. Her freshman year passed in a blur of late-night study sessions and early-morning journalism labs. Grace threw herself into her coursework with the intensity of someone seeking refuge from her own thoughts. She won awards for her feature writing and earned a coveted position as a sophomore correspondent for the campus newspaper. During spring break, Grace returned home for the first time since Christmas. The town looked smaller than she remembered, its familiar streets and buildings somehow diminished by her expanded worldview. She spent her days catching up with high school friends who had remained local, listening to their stories of community college and local jobs with a mixture of nostalgia and restless energy. On her last day home, Grace found herself walking past Riverside Park. The baseball fields were empty in the late afternoon light, but she could almost hear the echo of children's voices and David's patient instructions. She sat on the bleachers where she had spent so many Saturday mornings, watching the shadows lengthen across the diamond. "Grace?" "Grace Taylor." She turned to find Mrs. Henderson, Emma's former teacher, approaching with a warm smile. "I thought that was you. How wonderful to see you home from college. Emma Carter will be so excited to hear I ran into you. She talks about you all the time." Grace's heart skipped. "How is Emma? And her father?" "Oh, they're both doing wonderfully. David got that promotion to crew chief, you know. They moved into a little house on Oak Street. Nothing fancy, but it has a fenced yard, and Emma is over the moon about getting a dog." Mrs. Henderson paused, studying Grace's face. "It's funny, David never did marry that librarian everyone thought he would. Sarah moved back to Springfield last fall. Some folks say he's too particular, but I think he's just devoted to Emma." Grace nodded, not trusting herself to respond. The knowledge that David remained single felt both like vindication and a fresh wound. Had he truly been too busy for romance, or was there another reason for his careful distance from potential partners? "You should stop by and say hello," Mrs. Henderson continued. "I know they'd both love to see you," but Grace couldn't bring herself to make that visit. She was no longer the 16-year-old girl who had believed love could conquer all practical considerations, but she wasn't yet the woman who could face David with complete emotional detachment. She existed in an uncomfortable middle ground, too old for her former certainty and too young for true acceptance. Instead, she returned to Northwestern with renewed determination to build a life that didn't revolve around a memory. She changed her major to include a double concentration in international relations, opened herself to study abroad opportunities, and began dating Alex with more intentional commitment. Yet late at night, when the dorm was quiet and her defenses were down, Grace found herself pulling out the team photograph and wondering if David ever thought about their conversation in the parking lot. Did he remember asking her to come back when she was older? Did he wonder if her feelings had changed, or if time had proven him right about the temporary nature of teenage emotions? The photograph from David's coaching days remained in her desk drawer, a talisman of a love that refused to fade despite distance and time. Grace was beginning to understand that some feelings weren't meant to be outgrown. They were meant to be transformed, deepened, and eventually, perhaps, fulfilled. 4 years had passed since Grace's confession in the Riverside Park parking lot, and life had carried both her and David forward in ways neither could have predicted. Grace stood in her cap and gown on Northwestern's graduation stage, diploma in hand, feeling a mixture of accomplishment and uncertainty about what came next. The journalism degree had opened doors she hadn't expected. A summer internship with the Chicago Tribune had led to a full-time position as a staff reporter, covering local government and community issues. At 22, Grace had found her professional calling in the same investigative work that had first drawn her to the field, finding stories that mattered, giving voice to people who might otherwise go unheard. Her apartment in Lincoln Park was small but charming, with exposed brick walls and windows that caught the morning light. She had learned to navigate the city's rhythms, to find comfort in the anonymity that came with urban living. Yet despite Chicago's endless offerings of culture and sophistication, Grace found herself drawn back to the small town she had been so eager to leave. Her visits home had become more frequent, carefully timed to avoid the baseball season when she might be tempted to seek out familiar faces at Riverside Park. She told herself it was about spending time with her aging parents, about maintaining connections to her roots. But the truth was more complicated. Through her mother's careful updates and Emma's continued letters, Grace had followed the trajectory of David's life from a distance. The promotion to crew chief had indeed led to the house on Oak Street, a modest 2-bedroom with the promised fenced yard. Emma, now 11, had indeed gotten her dog, not named Baseball but rather Scout, after her favorite character in To Kill a Mockingbird. Emma's letters had evolved with her age, becoming more sophisticated while retaining the warmth that had always characterized their correspondence. She wrote about middle school challenges and friendship dramas, about her father's patient help with algebra and his terrible attempts at cooking dinner when they couldn't afford takeout. "Daddy says I'm too young to understand why grown-ups make things so complicated," Emma had written in her most recent letter. He was looking at an old picture from his baseball coaching days and got that sad look he gets sometimes when he thinks I'm not watching. "I told him maybe some complications work themselves out if you wait long enough. He laughed and said I was getting too wise for my own good." Grace had read that passage multiple times, wondering what picture Emma had seen and what thoughts had put that sad expression on David's face. Was it possible that their conversation 4 years ago still lingered in his memory the way it did in hers? Her dating life in Chicago had settled into a comfortable pattern with Alex, who had followed through on his law school plans and was now working as a public defender. He was everything her parents hoped for in a potential son-in-law: educated, ambitious, socially conscious. He spoke about marriage in theoretical terms, the kind of eventual commitment that successful couples move toward after appropriate courtship periods. Grace cared for Alex deeply, appreciated his intelligence and dedication to justice. When he kissed her, she felt fondness and compatibility. When they made love, she felt satisfied in a pleasant, uncomplicated way. It was exactly the kind of mature, rational relationship that her 16-year-old self would have been incapable of appreciating. Yet something was missing. Grace found herself going through the motions of adult romance without the transcendent connection she had experienced, however briefly, with David. She wondered if her expectations had been permanently skewed by her first experience of deep feeling, or if she was simply not capable of the kind of love that transformed rather than merely complemented. It was during one of these philosophical spirals that Grace received news that would change everything. Her mother's weekly phone call contained the usual updates about local politics and social events, delivered in the carefully neutral tone Patricia used when discussing topics she found significant. "Oh, and Emma Carter graduated from 8th grade last week," her mother mentioned casually. "Valedictorian, can you believe it?" That girl has certainly inherited her father's work ethic, Grace smiled, genuinely pleased by Emma's academic success. That's wonderful. She always was incredibly bright. David must be so proud. Though I suppose he's also feeling a bit melancholy about her growing up so fast. Sarah Mitchell was asking about him at the grocery store. Apparently she's moved back to town and is wondering if he might be interested in dinner sometime. Grace's hand tightened on the phone receiver. Sarah's back? Oh yes, got a position as head librarian. Much better salary than what Springfield was offering. She was always sweet on David, you know. Maybe now that Emma's older, he'll be more open to companionship. The conversation continued with other local news, but Grace barely heard the rest. Sarah Mitchell had returned, and David's daughter was growing up. The careful reasons he had given for remaining single, his focus on Emma, his financial constraints, his busy work schedule were gradually disappearing. That night, Grace lay in bed staring at the ceiling of her Chicago apartment, Alex sleeping peacefully beside her. She tried to imagine David and Sarah together, tried to picture him finding happiness with someone appropriate and available. The mental exercise left her feeling hollow and slightly sick. For 4 years, Grace had told herself she was respecting David's wishes, giving him space to live his life without the complication of her feelings. But she was beginning to realize that respect had become avoidance, and avoidance had become a form of cowardice. At 22, Grace was no longer the teenager who had poured her heart out in a parking lot. She had lived independently, built a career, navigated complex adult relationships. She had proven to herself and the world that she was capable of making mature decisions about her own life. The question was whether those decisions should include finally addressing the feelings that had never truly disappeared, or accepting that some chapters of life were meant to remain unfinished. 3 days later, Grace submitted a request for a leave of absence from the Tribune. She told her editor she needed time to work on a book project about small-town communities in transition. She told Alex she needed space to figure out what she really wanted from life. She told her parents she was coming home for an extended visit. She told herself she was finally ready to face whatever truth awaited her in the place where her story had begun. Emma's graduation ceremony was held in the same high school auditorium where Grace had received her own diploma 6 years earlier. Grace sat in the back, watching David beam with pride as his daughter delivered her valedictorian address about the importance of community and the courage required to pursue your dreams. Emma had grown into a poised young woman, tall for her age with David's dark hair and serious eyes. Her speech was thoughtful and articulate, touching on themes of family, perseverance, and the value of staying true to your principles even when the path forward wasn't clear. David sat in the front row, wearing a suit that Grace suspected was purchased specifically for this occasion. His hair showed more silver than she remembered, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of years of worry and responsibility. But his smile as he watched Emma was radiant, the expression of a father whose greatest accomplishment was the confident young woman addressing her graduating class. After the ceremony, Grace lingered in the parking lot, watching families celebrate their children's achievements. She saw David and Emma surrounded by well-wishers, accepting congratulations and taking photographs. Several times, her gaze caught David scanning the crowd as if looking for someone specific. Grace was about to leave when Emma spotted her across the parking lot. The girl's face lit up with surprised delight, and she broke away from the crowd to run toward Grace with arms outstretched. Grace, I can't believe you're here! Emma's embrace was fierce and genuine. 4 years of separation dissolved in an instant. I wouldn't have missed it, Grace said, meaning every word. Your speech was beautiful, Emma. You should be incredibly proud. Are you staying in town? Daddy's taking me to dinner at Romano's to celebrate. You should come with us. Grace glanced over Emma's shoulder to see David approaching, his expression unreadable. 4 years fell away in an instant, and Grace felt 16 again, nervous and hopeful, and completely unprepared for the impact of seeing him face to face. Grace stood frozen in the parking lot, Emma's enthusiastic invitation hanging in the air between them as David approached. The years had been kind to him. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had weathered difficulties and emerged stronger. His work shirt was pressed, his hair neatly combed for Emma's special day, and when he looked at Grace, she saw recognition flicker across his features, followed by something more complex. "Hello, Grace," David said, his voice carefully neutral. "This is unexpected." "I hope it's okay that I came," Grace replied, suddenly uncertain about her decision to attend. Emma's graduation seemed like such an important milestone. "Of course it's okay," Emma interjected before David could respond. "Daddy, you remember Grace, right? She used to help with my homework when I was little, and she's been writing me letters all through middle school." David's expression softened slightly. "I remember." An awkward silence settled over them, broken by the arrival of other parents congratulating Emma on her speech. Grace used the distraction to study David more carefully, noting the way he interacted with his daughter's classmates and their families. He was respected here, she realized. No longer the struggling single father working multiple jobs, but an established member of the community whose opinion carried weight. "So, about dinner," Emma said when the crowd had thinned. "Grace, you have to come. Romano's has the best tiramisu in 3 counties, and I want to hear all about your job in Chicago." Grace looked to David, searching his face for guidance. He seemed to be wrestling with something internal, his jaw working slightly the way it did when he was thinking through a difficult decision. "If Grace is available," David said finally, "she's welcome to join us." The dinner invitation felt like a test, though Grace wasn't sure what she was being tested for. Romano's was the kind of family restaurant where generations of local residents had celebrated important occasions, its walls covered with photographs of graduations, anniversaries, and Little League championships. Grace had eaten there countless times growing up. But tonight it felt strange and significant. Emma dominated the conversation, chattering about high school plans and summer jobs, with the excitement of someone standing on the threshold of new adventures. She had inherited David's thoughtfulness, but expressed it with a teenage girl's enthusiasm that was both charming and slightly overwhelming. "I'm going to work at the library this summer," Emma announced, stabbing her spaghetti with theatrical emphasis. "Mrs. Mitchell, she's the new head librarian, says I can help with the children's reading program. Daddy thinks it's good experience for college applications." Grace's heart skipped at the mention of Sarah Mitchell, but she kept her expression neutral. "That sounds like wonderful experience. Do you know what you want to study in college?" "Journalism, actually," Emma said, glancing at her father with a slightly defiant expression. "Daddy thinks it's impractical, but I want to write stories that matter. Like you do." David's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "I never said it was impractical. I said it was competitive and you should have a backup plan." "Same thing," Emma replied, with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her own abilities. Grace didn't have a backup plan, and look how well she's doing. Grace felt David's eyes on her and looked up to meet his gaze. There was something searching in his expression, as if he was trying to reconcile the successful young woman sitting across from him with the 16-year-old girl who had confessed her feelings in a parking lot 4 years ago. "Actually," Grace said carefully, "having a backup plan isn't a bad idea. The journalism industry can be unpredictable." Emma rolled her eyes with teenage certainty. "You're just saying that because you're adults, and adults always worry about everything." David laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "Guilty as charged. Worrying about you is part of my job description." The conversation continued through dessert, Emma regaling them with stories about her teachers and classmates, while David and Grace maintained careful politeness. Grace found herself studying David's hands as he gestured, remembering the gentleness with which he had once brushed a tear from her cheek. She noticed that he still wore no wedding ring, that his fingers bore the same small scars from construction work, that his laugh lines had deepened with age and experience. When dinner ended, David insisted on walking Grace to her car, despite Emma's protests that she wanted to continue catching up. The summer evening was warm and pleasant, the kind of night that made small-town life feel like a Norman Rockwell painting. "Thank you for coming tonight," David said when they reached Grace's car. "It meant a lot to Emma. She's always looked up to you." "She's become an amazing young woman," Grace replied. "You should be incredibly proud." "I am." David was quiet for a moment, his hands in his pockets. "Grace, can I ask you something?" Grace's heart rate accelerated. "Of course. Are you happy? In Chicago, I mean. With your life, your career, everything." The question caught her off guard with its directness. Grace considered lying, giving him the easy answer that would preserve the careful distance they had maintained. Instead, she found herself speaking truthfully. "I'm successful," she said. "I'm independent. I have a job I care about and a relationship that makes sense on paper." "But happy?" She paused, searching for the right words. "I think I'm still figuring out what that means." David nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he had suspected. "I've been thinking about what you said that night. About coming back when you were older." Grace's breath caught. And I've been wondering if I was wrong to ask you to wait. If maybe I was just scared of what you represented. What did I represent?" David looked at her directly, his brown eyes serious. "The possibility of something I didn't think I deserved. The chance to be loved for who I was, rather than what I could provide." Grace felt tears threaten and blinked them back. "David, I'm not saying this to complicate your life," he continued quickly. "I know you have a good thing going in Chicago. I just wanted you to know that these 4 years haven't made me forget. If anything, they've helped me understand what I lost when I asked you to leave." The admission hung between them in the warm evening air. Grace could hear Emma calling from the restaurant entrance, wondering what was taking so long. The moment felt suspended, full of possibility and fraught with the weight of time lost. "I should go," Grace said softly, though she made no move toward her car. "I know," David replied. But he didn't step back. "Emma's waiting, yes. And Sarah Mitchell is probably wondering if you'll call her." David's expression shifted slightly. "Sarah's a nice woman. She deserves someone who can love her completely. And you can't." "No," David said simply. "I can't. Turns out some feelings don't fade just because they're inconvenient." Grace felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of a knot she had carried for 4 years. "I broke up with Alex 3 weeks ago." "Why?" "Because I finally admitted to myself that I was settling for something safe instead of fighting for something real." David took a step closer, close enough that Grace could smell the familiar scent of his aftershave and see the silver threading through his dark hair. "And what feels real to you?" "This," Grace whispered. "Standing here with you, finally saying what we've both been thinking. It feels more real than anything I've experienced in 4 years. Grace, Daddy!" Emma's voice carried across the parking lot, impatient and slightly exasperated. "What are you two talking about?" "Grace, are you coming to see our new house?" David smiled ruefully. "Rain check on this conversation?" Grace nodded, her heart racing with the implications of what had just passed between them. "I'm staying in town for a few weeks. My parents' house." "I know where to find you," David said, and something in his voice made Grace's knees feel weak as she drove home that night. Grace replayed every word of their conversation, analyzing each pause and inflection for hidden meaning. David had essentially admitted that his feelings for her had never disappeared, that he regretted asking her to wait. But he had also been careful not to push, not to assume that her presence meant she wanted to resume what they had started 4 years ago. The ball, Grace realized, was now in her court. At 22, she was old enough to make her own choices about love and risk. The question was whether she had the courage to act on what she wanted, or if she would let fear and uncertainty keep her trapped in the safety of inaction. For the first time in years, Grace felt truly awake, every nerve ending alive with possibility. Tomorrow, she decided, she would start figuring out what came next. 3 days after Emma's graduation dinner, Grace found herself standing in the aisle of Henderson's hardware store. staring at paint samples and trying to work up the courage to approach the counter where David was helping an elderly customer select the right screws for a garden gate repair. She had been avoiding him since their conversation in the parking lot, needing time to process the implications of his admission. The hardware store was David's third job, no longer. He now worked there part-time on weekends, helping out his friend Mike Henderson, who had taken over the family business. Grace had learned this from her mother, who seemed to have appointed herself as an unofficial intelligence source regarding David's current activities. Grace Taylor, as I live and breathe. Grace turned to find Mike Henderson approaching with a broad smile, his arms outstretched in greeting. She had known Mike since childhood. He was 10 years older than her, a former high school football star who had returned home after college to help his aging father run the store. "Mike, how wonderful to see you." Grace accepted his embrace, grateful for the distraction from her David watching. "Heard you were back in town." Big city journalist returns to her roots. Sounds like the beginning of one of those heartwarming movies my wife loves to watch. Mike's grin was infectious. "What brings you to our humble establishment? Finally ready to learn the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver?" Grace laughed despite her nervous energy. "Actually, I'm helping my parents repaint their guest bedroom. Thought I'd pick up some supplies while I'm trying to decide between morning mist and gentle dawn. Ah, the eternal struggle. Personally, I think paint companies just make up those names to justify charging $20 more per gallon." Mike gestured toward the counter where David was finishing with his customer. "David's our paint expert these days. Guy's got an eye for color that puts most interior designers to shame." Before Grace could protest, Mike was calling out across the store. "Hey, David! Got a customer here who needs your artistic expertise." David looked up, his eyes meeting Grace's across the displays of lawn mowers and garden hoses. For a moment, his expression was unguarded, showing a mixture of surprise and something that might have been pleasure. Then the careful politeness she was beginning to recognize slid back into place. "What can I help you with?" David asked as he approached, his tone professionally neutral despite the intensity of his gaze. Grace held up the paint samples, feeling ridiculous. "My mother wants to redecorate the guest room. I'm supposed to choose between these two shades of what I'm pretty sure is the exact same color." David took the samples, his fingers brushing hers briefly as he examined them. "They're actually quite different. Morning mist has blue undertones. It'll feel cooler, more contemporary. Gentle dawn has yellow undertones, warmer and more traditional. Depends on the lighting in the room and what feeling you're trying to create. See?" Mike interjected with obvious pride. "Told you he was good. David's helped half the town with their decorating projects. Turns out construction workers know a thing or two about how colors work in different spaces." Grace found herself genuinely interested in David's explanation, asking questions about primer and finish types, while trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened every time he looked directly at her. They were discussing the merits of eggshell versus satin finish when Emma burst through the store's front door, her face flushed with excitement. "Daddy! Daddy, you'll never guess what just happened." Emma spotted Grace, and her expression grew even brighter. "Grace, perfect timing. You have to hear this too." David's attention immediately shifted to his daughter, his parental concern evident. "What's wrong? You look like you've been running." "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. I just came from the bank with my college fund deposit, and Mrs. Patterson told me the most amazing thing." Emma paused, dramatically, clearly savoring the moment. "Someone has been making anonymous deposits into my account for years. Hundreds of dollars, maybe thousands. Mrs. Patterson said it started when I was in 3rd grade and has continued every few months since then." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. She had been so careful, using money orders and different banks, ensuring that her contributions to Emma's education fund could never be traced back to her. The deposits had been modest. $50 here, $100 there, amounts she hoped would help without drawing attention. David's expression had gone very still. "Anonymous deposits? Yes, isn't it wonderful? Mrs. Patterson said whoever it was must really care about my education. She called them my guardian angel. Can you imagine? Someone out there has been helping us all this time, and we never even knew. Emma's joy was infectious, but Grace noticed that David was no longer looking at his daughter. He was looking at Grace with an expression of dawning realization. "Emma," David said quietly, never taking his eyes off Grace, "why don't you go help Mike load Mrs. Davidson's mulch into her truck? I need to discuss paint options with Grace." Emma nodded enthusiastically and bounced toward the back of the store, still chattering about her mysterious benefactor. Grace remained frozen by the paint display, her heart hammering as David stepped closer. "How long?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what you mean," Grace said, but her voice was shaking. "How long have you been making deposits into Emma's college account?" Grace opened her mouth to deny it, but something in David's expression stopped her. He looked hurt and confused and grateful all at once, as if trying to process emotions too complex for simple categories. "Since her third-grade year," Grace admitted quietly. "Just small amounts. Money I would have spent on unnecessary things anyway. I wanted to help, but I knew you wouldn't accept it if you knew it came from me." David was quiet for so long that Grace began to wonder if he was angry. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Do you have any idea what those deposits meant? How many nights I stayed awake worrying about college costs, about whether I'd be able to give Emma the opportunities she deserved." David's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "And there were months when that extra money made the difference between making ends meet and falling behind." "I'm sorry," Grace said quickly. "I know you're proud, and I never meant to interfere. Sorry." David's voice cracked slightly. "Grace, you helped raise my daughter. You've been part of her life all these years, even when I thought you were gone for good." Grace felt tears spill over, unable to contain them any longer. "I couldn't stop caring about her. About both of you. I tried to stay away, to build a life that didn't include you, but I couldn't stop wanting to help." David reached out and gently wiped a tear from her cheek, the gesture so familiar and tender that Grace's breath caught. "You never stopped loving us." It wasn't a question, and Grace didn't treat it like one. "No, I never stopped. And all this time, I thought I was protecting you by keeping my distance. I thought I was doing the noble thing, letting you build a life with someone more appropriate." David's thumb traced along her cheekbone. "But you were already part of our lives. You've been Emma's guardian angel all along." The revelation hung between them, recontextualizing 4 years of careful separation. Grace had never truly left. She had simply found a way to love them from a distance, to remain connected despite David's well-intentioned attempts to set her free. "What does this mean?" Grace whispered. "It means," David said, his voice growing stronger, "that I've been an idiot for 4 years. It means that some kinds of love don't respect boundaries or age differences or practical considerations." He stepped closer, close enough that Grace could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "It means that maybe it's time to stop being so careful about what other people think is appropriate." "David, I love you," he said simply, the words falling between them like stones into still water. "I've loved you since you were 16 years old, and I love you now that you're 22. I love your courage and your kindness and the way you've never stopped fighting for what matters to you." Grace felt the world shift around her. 4 years of uncertainty crystallizing into perfect clarity. "I love you too. I've never stopped loving you." David smiled then, the first truly unguarded expression she had seen from him since her return. "So what do we do now?" "Now," Grace said, reaching up to touch his face, "we stop wasting time." The revelation in Henderson's hardware store changed everything and nothing all at once. David and Grace stood in the paint aisle, hands touching, hearts finally honest, while the normal business of small-town life continued around them. Mike Henderson whistled while restocking shelves. Emma chatted with customers about her college plans, and the afternoon sun streamed through windows dusty with summer pollen. "We should probably talk about this somewhere more private," David said, his thumb still tracing gentle circles on Grace's wrist. "Emma's going to notice soon that we're not actually discussing paint colors." Grace nodded, though she was reluctant to break the spell of finally being honest with each other. "Your house?" "My house," David agreed, then hesitated. Unless you think that's moving too fast. We could meet somewhere neutral, take this slow, David. Grace's voice was gentle but firm. I've been waiting 4 years for this conversation. I think we've taken it plenty slow. They agreed to meet that evening, after David finished his shift at the hardware store. Grace spent the intervening hours in a state of nervous anticipation, changing clothes 3 times and driving her mother to distraction with her restless energy. You're like a cat on a hot tin roof, Patricia observed over dinner. What's gotten into you today? Grace pushed her salad around her plate, too anxious to eat. Just thinking about some decisions I need to make. About your job in Chicago? I do hope you're not considering anything rash. That Tribune position is exactly the kind of opportunity your father and I always hoped you'd have. The assumption that Grace's future lay in Chicago felt suddenly presumptuous. Her parents had invested so much in her education and career success that it seemed cruel to suggest their careful plans might not align with her own desires. Yet Grace was beginning to understand that living someone else's version of her life, however well-intentioned, was a form of slow suffocation. We'll see, Grace said noncommittally, earning a sharp look from her mother. At 7 o'clock, Grace stood outside David's house on Oak Street, taking in the small front porch with its hanging baskets of petunias and the carefully maintained lawn, where a golden retriever, Scout, she presumed, lay panting in the shade of an oak tree. The house was exactly what she would have imagined David choosing, modest but well-kept, practical but welcoming. David answered the door before she could knock, as if he had been watching for her arrival. He had changed from his work clothes into khakis and a button-down shirt that brought out the warm brown of his eyes. His hair was still damp from a recent shower, and Grace caught the scent of soap and aftershave that was becoming familiar again. Emma's at her friend Madison's house, David said as he led Grace through a living room furnished with comfortable, mismatched pieces that somehow worked together perfectly. Sleepover. She was very excited about giving us grown-up time to catch up properly. Grace smiled at Emma's matchmaking instincts. She always was perceptive, too perceptive sometimes. She figured out I was nervous about tonight and gave me a lecture about not overthinking things. David gestured toward the kitchen. Coffee or something stronger? I have wine, though I should warn you, it's the cheap kind. Wine sounds perfect. David's kitchen was small but efficient, with a round table that probably served as homework station. Bill-paying desk and dining room all in one. Grace watched him pour wine into mismatched glasses, noting the way his hands shook slightly with nerves. It was endearing to realize that David Carter, who had always seemed so composed and self-assured, was as affected by this moment as she was. So, David said, handing her a glass and settling into the chair across from her. Here we are, Grace agreed, then found herself laughing at the awkwardness of it all. This is surreal. 4 years of wondering what this conversation would be like, and now I have no idea what to say. We could start with the obvious question, David suggested. What happens next? Grace took a sip of wine, buying herself time to think. I suppose that depends on what we both want. I want you, David said simply, his directness taking Grace's breath away. I want to see if what we felt 4 years ago can become something real and lasting. I want to stop being so damn careful about everything and just live. And Emma, how do you think she'll feel about this? David's smile was rueful. Emma's been asking me for years why I never date anyone seriously. Last week, she informed me that she's tired of being my only reason to get up in the morning. That I need to find my own happiness instead of living through hers. Wise kid. Too wise. Just like her honorary big sister. David reached across the table to take Grace's hand. Grace, I need to be honest about something. These 4 years haven't been easy for me. Not just because I missed you, but because I started to doubt my own judgment about everything. What do you mean? I mean that asking you to wait, to come back when you were older. It felt like the right thing to do at the time. Honorable, protective. But watching you leave, knowing I might have lost you forever, it made me question whether I was being noble or just scared. Grace squeezed his fingers. Both, probably, but also realistic. I was 16, David. I thought I knew what I wanted, but I didn't know who I was yet. And now I know exactly who I am and what I want. Grace met his eyes steadily. I want you. I want this life you've built, this community you're part of. I want to help Emma navigate high school and college applications. I want to wake up next to you and argue about what color to paint the guest room. David's eyes darkened. Grace, I know it means giving up Chicago. I know it means disappointing my parents and probably confusing a lot of people who think I'm throwing away my career for a man. But this isn't about throwing anything away. It's about choosing the life that actually fits instead of the one that looks good on paper. David was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to read her sincerity. You'd really leave Chicago? Give up the Tribune? There are newspapers here too. Stories that need telling. And if there aren't enough local opportunities, I'll freelance. I'll write that book I've been thinking about. The point is, I can be a journalist anywhere. But I can only be with you here. What about your parents? They've invested so much in your education, your career. They invested in my happiness, Grace corrected. They just had a different idea of what that would look like. But parents don't get to choose their children's lives forever. Eventually, we have to choose for ourselves. David brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I love you so much it terrifies me. Good, Grace said, her heart racing at the tenderness in his voice. Being terrified means it matters. They talked until nearly midnight, covering 4 years of separation and shared dreams for the future. David told her about his promotion to crew chief and his plans to eventually start his own construction company. Grace described her work at the Tribune and her growing conviction that her true calling lay in long-form storytelling. Rather than daily journalism, they discussed practical matters too, where Grace would live. While she sorted out her Chicago apartment, how to tell Emma and Grace's parents about their relationship, whether Grace should look for work locally or focus on freelance opportunities initially. There's something else we need to talk about, David said as Grace prepared to leave. They stood at his front door, reluctant to end the evening despite the late hour. What's that? The physical aspect of this. We're not teenagers anymore, Grace. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it as adults, with all that implies. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. I know what it implies, and I want that too. All of it. David stepped closer, close enough that Grace could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. I've waited 4 years to kiss you properly, to hold you without feeling like I was taking advantage of someone too young to understand the consequences. Then stop waiting, Grace whispered. David's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs tracing along her cheekbones with reverent gentleness. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. When David finally kissed her, it was with 4 years of restraint and longing poured into a single perfect moment. Grace melted against him, her hands fisting in his shirt as she finally tasted the lips she had dreamed about for so long. The kiss was everything she had imagined and nothing like she had expected. Deeper than her teenage fantasies, but somehow more real, more grounding. This wasn't the desperate passion of forbidden attraction, but the steady flame of genuine love, sustainable and warming. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. David rested his forehead against hers. His eyes closed as if trying to memorize the moment. Tomorrow, he said, his voice rough with emotion, we start figuring out how to build a life together. Tomorrow, Grace agreed, her heart so full she thought it might burst. But David? Yeah? I don't want to wait anymore. Not for anything. David's smile was radiant, transforming his face with joy. Then we won't. As Grace drove home that night, she felt lighter than she had in years. For the first time since she was 16 years old, her future felt bright and certain. She was going home, not to her parents' house or to Chicago, but to the life she was finally brave enough to claim. The next morning brought the kind of brilliant sunshine that made everything seem possible. Grace woke in her childhood bedroom feeling transformed, as if the conversation with David had somehow realigned her entire world. She lay in bed, listening to her parents moving around downstairs, preparing for their Saturday routines, and tried to figure out how to tell them that their daughter's carefully planned life was about to take a dramatic detour. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Good morning. Emma wants to know if you'd like to come to the farmer's market with us. Fair warning, she's planning to interrogate you about your intentions regarding her father." Grace smiled, typing back, "Tell her my intentions are entirely honorable. What time?" 10 o'clock. "Meet us at the courthouse square. See you there." Grace dressed carefully, choosing a sundress that was pretty but not too formal, wanting to strike the right balance for what would essentially be her first public appearance as David's girlfriend. Seemed too juvenile for their situation, but partner felt premature. She supposed they would figure out the terminology as they went along. The farmer's market was a beloved Saturday tradition in their small town, with local vendors selling everything from fresh produce to handmade crafts. Grace had missed the community atmosphere during her years in Chicago, where shopping for groceries was a solitary task completed in sterile supermarkets rather than a social event. She spotted David and Emma near the tomato stand, Emma gesticulating enthusiastically while David listened with patient amusement. As Grace approached, she could hear Emma explaining her summer reading list to Mrs. Patterson from the bank, who was nodding along with grandmotherly attention. "Grace!" Emma spotted her first, breaking away from her conversation to envelop Grace in an enthusiastic hug. "Perfect timing. Mrs. Patterson was just telling me about a writing contest for high school students. You could give me advice." "I'd be happy to," Grace said, accepting Mrs. Patterson's warm greeting and trying not to feel self-conscious about the speculative looks the older woman was giving her and David. They moved through the market together, Emma leading the way, with Scout trotting beside her on his leash. Grace found herself falling into step with David, their shoulders brushing as they walked. The casual contact sent small shivers of awareness through her body, a constant reminder of the new intimacy between them. "So," Emma said with the directness that characterized all her conversations, "Daddy told me you two are dating now." Grace nearly choked on the sample of honey bread she had just accepted from a vendor. "He did? Well, not in so many words. But he's been grinning like an idiot all morning, and he actually hummed while making breakfast." "Daddy never hums." Emma studied Grace with serious brown eyes so like her father's. "Are you going to move back home?" Grace glanced at David, who was trying unsuccessfully to hide his amusement at his daughter's interrogation techniques. "We're still figuring things out, Em. Because if you are, I think you should know that Daddy snores sometimes, and he always steals the covers. Also, he can't cook anything that doesn't come with instructions on the box." "Emma!" David's face was red with embarrassment. "What?" Grace should know what she's getting into. "Oh, and he's terrible at putting the toilet seat down. I've been training him for years with limited success." Grace burst into laughter, charmed by Emma's matter-of-fact approach to her father's romantic life. "Thank you for the warnings. I'll keep them in mind." "Good. Now that that's settled, can we get funnel cake?" "I've been thinking about it all week." As they waited in line for Emma's funnel cake, Grace felt the weight of curious stares from other market-goers. News traveled fast in small towns, and she suspected that by evening, half the community would know that Grace Taylor and David Carter had been seen together looking very much like a couple. "People are staring," Grace murmured to David. "Let them stare," David replied, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. "I'm tired of caring what other people think about my happiness." The simple gesture of holding hands in public felt revolutionary. Grace remembered being 16 and desperate for any sign that David might see her as more than Emma's helpful tutor. Now at 22, she was standing beside him as an equal partner, their relationship acknowledged and celebrated rather than hidden. Grace Taylor, "As I live and breathe." Grace turned to find Sarah Mitchell approaching, looking as lovely as ever, in a flowing skirt and peasant blouse that perfectly suited her Earth Mother aesthetic. Grace felt a stab of insecurity, remembering all the times her mother had mentioned Sarah's interest in David. Sarah! How nice to see you again. Grace managed what she hoped was a genuine smile. I heard you were back in town. How exciting. Sarah's gaze moved between Grace and David, taking in their joined hands with a slightly wistful expression. And David, hello. Emma was telling me all about her summer plans when she stopped by the library yesterday. Sarah, David nodded politely, but Grace noticed that he didn't release her hand or step away to create distance. I should congratulate you both, Sarah continued with the kind of gracious smile that spoke well of her character. The whole town's been wondering when David would finally start dating seriously again. I'm glad he found someone who makes him happy. The words were kind, but Grace heard the subtext. Sarah had clearly harbored hopes regarding David, and seeing him with Grace, especially Grace, who represented a complication Sarah couldn't have anticipated, must have been painful. That's very kind of you to say, Grace replied. Meaning it. Well, I should let you get back to your morning. Emma, don't forget about our meeting on Monday to discuss the youth volunteer program. Sarah smiled once more and melted back into the crowd. That was awkward, Emma observed with teenage bluntness. Mrs. Mitchell has been trying to get Daddy to ask her out for months. I told her he wasn't interested, but she kept bringing him books she thought he'd like. Emma, David said with gentle reproach. What? It's true. And now she knows why you weren't interested. Grace is much prettier anyway, and she actually understands your weird obsession with baseball statistics. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, touched by Emma's fierce loyalty and slightly overwhelmed by the implications of the encounter. Dating David meant becoming part of a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, where their relationship would be subject to constant observation and commentary. Second thoughts? David asked quietly, as Emma ran ahead to examine a display of handmade jewelry. About what? About all of this. The small-town fishbowl effect. The complications with people like Sarah, who've been part of my life here. Grace considered the question seriously. There would be challenges, professional limitations, social complexities. The constant awareness that their relationship would be public property in a way it never would have been in Chicago. No second thoughts, she said firmly. This is what I want, David. All of it, including the parts that might be difficult. David's smile was radiant. Good, because there's something I want to ask you. Grace's heart rate accelerated. What? Before David could respond, Emma came bounding back with Scout in tow, her face bright with excitement. Daddy! Mrs. Henderson wants to know if you can help move some furniture for the church yard sale next weekend. I told her you'd probably say yes because you're too nice to say no to church ladies. David laughed, the moment of private conversation lost to his daughter's enthusiasm. You're probably right. Tell Mrs. Henderson I'll call her later to work out the details. As they continued through the market, Grace found herself studying the interactions between David and the other vendors and customers. He was clearly well liked and respected in the community, sought out for advice and assistance, trusted with responsibilities that went beyond mere neighborliness. This was the life she was choosing, not just David and Emma, but the web of relationships and obligations that came with being part of a small town. It felt right in a way that her independent Chicago existence never had, as if she was finally stepping into a role that had been waiting for her all along. Grace, David said, as they headed back toward their cars, Emma having run ahead to put Scout in David's truck. What I wanted to ask earlier, yes. Grace turned to face him, something in his tone making her pulse quicken. David pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, and Grace's world suddenly tilted on its axis. I know this might seem fast, and I know we still have a lot to figure out, but I've been carrying this around for 2 weeks, ever since I realized you might actually come back. Grace stared at the box, her hands trembling as David opened it to reveal a simple solitaire diamond ring. It wasn't large or flashy, but it was perfect, classic and timeless, and exactly what she would have chosen for herself. Grace Taylor, David said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Will you marry me? Grace stared at the ring, her mind reeling. The diamond caught the morning sunlight, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the velvet interior of the box. Around them, the farmer's market continued its cheerful Saturday rhythm, but Grace felt as if time had stopped completely. "David," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," David replied, his brown eyes never leaving her face. "I know it's fast. I know we just admitted our feelings yesterday. But Grace, I've been in love with you for 4 years. I've had 4 years to think about what my life would look like with you in it. And I don't want to waste any more time being careful or practical." Grace's hands were shaking so hard she could barely focus on the ring. "What about Emma? Have you talked to her about this?" David's smile grew tender. "Emma's the one who helped me pick out the ring. She said, and I quote, 'Daddy, if you don't marry Grace, someone else will, and then we'll both be miserable forever,' as if summoned by the mention of her name." Emma appeared at Grace's elbow, having apparently abandoned Scout to his nap in the truck. "Did you ask her? What did she say?" "Grace, you have to say yes, because I already told Madison you were going to be my stepmom, and she's super jealous." "Emma," David's face reddened. "We talked about giving Grace space to think about it." "What's to think about?" Emma demanded with teenage logic. "You love each other, right? And Grace, you want to stay here instead of going back to Chicago, right? So get married and live happily ever after. It's not complicated." Grace looked between David and Emma, these two people who had somehow become the center of her universe without her fully realizing it. Emma's expectant face and David's nervous hopefulness made her heart ache with the overwhelming intensity of her feelings. "It's not that simple, Em," Grace said gently. "Marriage is a big decision. There are practical things to consider." "Like what?" Emma interrupted. "You both have jobs. You like each other. You both love me. What else matters?" Out of the mouths of babes, Grace thought. What else did matter? Her parents' expectations? The opinions of people who thought she was throwing away her career? The conventional wisdom that said couples should date for years before making such a commitment? "Grace," David said quietly, "I need you to know that I'm not asking because I think we should, or because it's the next logical step. I'm asking because I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore. Because yesterday, when we finally said what we've been feeling all these years, it felt like coming home." Grace felt tears spill over, hot against her cheeks in the warm morning air. "David, I know I'm not the safe choice," David continued, his voice gaining strength. "I know marrying me means giving up opportunities in Chicago, means settling for a smaller life than what your parents planned for you. But I promise you this, I will love you with everything I have for as long as I live. I will support your dreams even when they scare me. And I will never ever take for granted the gift of having you choose me." The proposal was everything Grace hadn't known she wanted, not grand or theatrical, but deeply personal and achingly honest. David wasn't offering her a perfect life or promising that things would be easy. He was offering her a real life, with all its complications and compromises and extraordinary ordinary moments. "Yes," Grace whispered, the word escaping before she could second-guess herself. "Yes." David's voice cracked slightly. "Yes," Grace repeated, stronger this time. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to all of it. The small-town life, the complications, the beautiful mess of building something real together." David's face transformed with joy as he slipped the ring onto Grace's finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting there all along. Emma let out a whoop of excitement that drew stares from nearby vendors, but Grace barely noticed. She was too busy being kissed by her fiancé, in the middle of the courthouse square, while their daughter danced around them with uncontainable glee. "I can't believe this is happening." Grace breathed against David's lips. "Believe it," David murmured back. "We're really doing this." "Daddy!" "Grace, look who's here!" Emma's voice cut through their private moment. Grace turned to see her parents approaching, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern. Patricia Taylor's gaze went immediately to Grace's left hand, where the diamond was catching the sunlight, and her face went pale. "Grace," her mother said carefully, "what's going on here?" Grace felt David's hand tighten on hers, a gesture of support that gave her courage. "Mom, Dad, I have some news. David and I are engaged." The silence that followed was deafening. Grace watched her father's face cycle through surprise, confusion, and what might have been disappointment. Her mother's expression was harder to read. Shock, certainly, but also a kind of resigned recognition, as if she had always known this moment would come. "Engaged," Robert Taylor repeated slowly. "As in planning to get married?" "That's generally what engaged means, Mr. Taylor," Emma piped up helpfully. Earning a gentle shush from David. "Grace," Patricia said, her real estate agent composure firmly in place. Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "David, I'm sure you understand that this is quite a surprise for us." "Of course," David replied with careful politeness. "Grace, why don't you go with your parents? We can talk later." Grace felt a moment of panic at the thought of being separated from David so soon after accepting his proposal. What if her parents talked her out of it? What if the weight of their disappointment made her doubt her own judgment? "Actually," Grace said, surprising herself with her firmness, "I think anything my parents need to say, they can say in front of my fiancé." The word felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. Fiancé. She was engaged to David Carter, the man she had loved since she was 16 years old, the man who had asked her to wait until she was ready and who had waited for her in return. Patricia's lips tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Very well. Grace, you're 22 years old with a promising career ahead of you. Are you certain you want to tie yourself down so young? Marriage is a serious commitment, not something to be entered into lightly." "I'm not entering into it lightly, Mom. I've been thinking about this for years." "Years?" Robert's eyebrows rose. "Grace, you've been in Chicago. How could you have been thinking about marrying David for years?" Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't back down. "Because I've been in love with him since I was 16. Because even when I tried to build a life without him, I couldn't stop caring about him and Emma. Because sometimes you just know when something is right." "You were 16, Patricia said, her voice strained. 16-year-olds think they know a lot of things that turn out to be nonsense." "Some things, yes," Grace agreed. "But not this. Never this." David stepped closer to Grace, his presence steady and reassuring. "Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, I understand your concerns. I know this seems sudden from your perspective, but I want you to know that I love your daughter more than my own life. I will do everything in my power to make her happy." "What about her career?" Robert asked bluntly. "Grace has worked incredibly hard to establish herself in Chicago. She has opportunities there that simply don't exist in a town this size." "I'll find other opportunities," Grace said, before David could respond. "There are stories everywhere, Dad. I don't need to be in Chicago to be a good journalist." "You need to be where the jobs are," Patricia pointed out with brutal practicality. "Grace, darling, love is wonderful, but it doesn't pay the bills or build a future." Emma, who had been listening to the adult conversation with growing indignation, finally couldn't contain herself any longer. "That's not true. Love is the most important thing. My daddy has worked 3 jobs to take care of me, and he never complained once because he loves me. And Grace has been helping pay for my college for years because she loves us too. Maybe grown-ups should worry less about money and more about being happy." The unexpected defense from Emma left the adults momentarily speechless. Grace felt a surge of love for this fierce, wise girl who was about to become her stepdaughter. "Emma's right," Grace said quietly. "Mom, Dad, I know you want what's best for me. I know you've invested a lot in my education and career. But what's best for me isn't necessarily what looks best on paper. What's best for me is building a life with people I love, doing work that matters, being part of a community that feels like home." Patricia's expression softened slightly, though she still looked troubled. "Oh, sweetheart, I just don't want you to wake up in 5 years and regret giving up so much. The only thing I'll regret," Grace said with certainty, "is if I let fear keep me from choosing happiness." 6 months later, Grace stood in front of the mirror in her childhood bedroom, adjusting the simple pearl necklace that had been her grandmother's. Her wedding dress was elegant in its simplicity. a cream-colored sheath that skimmed her figure without fuss, chosen more for its timeless quality than for its ability to make a statement. She had learned over the past months that the most important statements were often the quiet ones. The intervening months had been a whirlwind of change and adjustment. Grace had given notice at the Tribune, packed up her Chicago apartment, and moved back to her hometown with a mixture of excitement and terror. Her parents had eventually come around to supporting her decision, though Grace suspected her mother still harbored hopes that the engagement was a phase Grace would outgrow. The transition hadn't been entirely smooth. Grace had struggled to find her professional footing in a smaller market, eventually settling on a combination of freelance work and a part-time position with the local weekly newspaper. The pay was significantly less than what she had earned in Chicago, but she found satisfaction in covering stories that directly impacted the community she now called home. David's construction company was growing steadily, buoyed by his reputation for quality work and fair dealing. He had hired 2 additional crew members and was considering expanding into residential development. The financial stress that had characterized his early years as a single father was finally easing, though both he and Grace remained committed to living within their means. Emma had thrown herself into high school with characteristic enthusiasm, excelling academically while participating in student government and the school newspaper. She had also appointed herself as unofficial wedding planner, approaching the task with the same methodical intensity she brought to all her projects. "Grace, are you ready?" Emma's voice came through the bedroom door, accompanied by a gentle knock. "Almost," Grace called back, taking one final look at her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked calm and confident, a far cry from the uncertain 16-year-old who had first confessed her feelings to David Carter in a parking lot. Emma entered without waiting for permission, as had become her habit over the past months. She looked lovely in her junior bridesmaid dress, a soft blue that complemented her dark hair and serious eyes. "You look beautiful," Emma said with the kind of matter-of-fact honesty that characterized all her observations. "Daddy's going to cry when he sees you." "He's been nervous all morning. He burned the toast and put his shirt on inside out twice." Grace smiled, touched by the image of David's wedding day jitters. They had decided on a small ceremony in the garden behind the town's historical society, with only immediate family and close friends in attendance. The intimacy felt right for their relationship. They had never been about grand gestures or public displays, but rather about quiet moments and steady devotion. "How are you feeling about all this, Em?" Grace asked, settling on the edge of the bed and patting the space beside her. "Really, I mean, not just the happy face you put on for your dad and me." Emma considered the question with characteristic seriousness before sitting down. "Scared sometimes," she admitted. "Not about you marrying Daddy. That part feels right. But about things changing, about whether I'll still be as important to him when he has you to focus on too." Grace felt her heart clench with empathy. "Emma, listen to me. Your father's love for you isn't diminished by his love for me. If anything, seeing how devoted he is to you is one of the things that made me fall in love with him in the first place. You will always be his first priority, his greatest achievement, but now you'll be his wife, and you'll be his daughter. Those are different relationships, not competing ones." Grace took Emma's hand, noting how the girl's fingers had grown longer and more graceful over the past months. "Besides, I'm hoping you'll let me be more than just your stepmother. I'm hoping we can be friends, the way we always have been." Emma's smile was radiant. "I'd like that. And Grace, I'm really glad Daddy waited for you. I think you were always meant to be part of our family." The words brought tears to Grace's eyes, threatening to ruin her carefully applied makeup. "I think so too." A soft knock on the door interrupted their moment. "Grace, sweetheart?" Patricia Taylor's voice was unusually tentative. "Come in, Mom." Patricia entered carrying a small wrapped box, her expression mixing pride and lingering concern. The past months had been challenging for Grace's relationship with her parents, who had struggled to understand her choices while trying to remain supportive. "I wanted to give you this before the ceremony," Patricia said, holding out the box. "It was your great-grandmother's, her wedding rings. I thought perhaps you might like to have them." Grace opened the box to reveal a simple gold band, nestled beside a modest engagement ring, both pieces showing the soft patina of age and wear. The gesture was unexpected and deeply meaningful, a sign that Patricia was finally accepting Grace's choice to build her life in their hometown. "Mom, they're beautiful." "Thank you. She married for love too, you know," Patricia said quietly. "Your great-grandfather was a farmer, not what her family would have considered a suitable match, but they were happy together for 53 years. Sometimes love is practical in ways that practical considerations aren't." The admission was as close to an apology as Patricia was likely to offer, and Grace accepted it in the spirit it was given. "I love you, Mom. I love you too, sweetheart. And I'm proud of you for having the courage to choose your own path." The wedding ceremony itself was everything Grace had hoped for: intimate, meaningful, and suffused with genuine joy. David looked handsome in his navy suit, his usually composed demeanor giving way to visible emotion as Grace walked down the makeshift aisle to join him. Emma served as both bridesmaid and ring-bearer, taking her dual responsibilities with characteristic seriousness. Grace's parents sat in the front row beside David's elderly aunt and uncle, the small gathering representing the people who mattered most to the couple. Pastor Williams, who had officiated at countless community weddings over his 4 decades of service, spoke about the patience required for true love and the courage needed to choose commitment over convenience. His words felt written specifically for Grace and David, acknowledging the unusual path that had brought them together. When it came time for vows, Grace and David had chosen to write their own. David spoke first, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "Grace, you taught me that love isn't just about feeling something. It's about choosing to act on those feelings every day, even when it's difficult. You waited for me to be ready to accept what you were offering, and then you waited some more while I figured out how to be worthy of it. Today I promise to spend the rest of my life proving that your faith in me wasn't misplaced." Grace's vows were simpler but no less heartfelt. "David, you showed me what real love looks like. Not the dramatic, desperate kind you see in movies, but the steady, sustaining kind that builds families and communities. You loved me enough to ask me to wait until I was ready to choose this life with full understanding of what it meant. Today, I choose you, I choose Emma, I choose this beautiful, imperfect, absolutely perfect life we're going to build together." The ring exchange was accompanied by Emma's proud grin and Patricia's discreet dabbing of tears. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the small crowd erupted in applause and cheers that seemed disproportionate to their numbers. As Grace and David shared their first kiss as a married couple, Emma threw her arms around both of them in an exuberant group hug that made everyone laugh and cry simultaneously. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, decorated with simple flowers from local gardens and lit by strings of white lights that Emma had insisted were absolutely essential for proper ambiance. The cake was homemade by Mrs. Henderson, the music was provided by David's friend Mike on his guitar, and the dancing consisted mainly of Emma teaching the adults moves she had learned in her school's drama club. As the evening wound down and guests began to drift home, Grace found herself standing in the doorway of the fellowship hall, watching David clean up while Emma supervised with the authority of someone who had appointed herself wedding coordinator. This was her life now, not the glamorous, sophisticated existence she had once imagined for herself, but something deeper and more sustaining. She was Grace Carter, wife and stepmother, small-town journalist and community member. She was exactly who she had always been meant to be. David caught her watching and crossed the room to wrap his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "No regrets, Mrs. Carter?" Grace leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of his body and the gentle pressure of his wedding ring against her fingers where their hands intertwined. "None whatsoever, Mr. Carter." "Good," David murmured against her ear, because I plan to love you for the next 50 years or so. Only 50? Grace teased, turning in his arms to face him. Well, we'll renegotiate the contract after that. See if you're still willing to put up with my snoring and cover stealing. I think I can manage that, Grace said. Rising on her tiptoes to kiss her husband, some love stories begin with instant attraction or dramatic passion. Others unfold slowly, built on friendship and mutual respect and the patient understanding that the best things in life are worth waiting for. Grace and David's story was the latter kind, a love that had grown stronger with time and distance, that had survived doubt and separation and the well-meaning interference of others. As they drove home that night, Emma asleep in the back seat, still wearing her bridesmaid dress, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 8 years ago, she had been a 16-year-old girl with an impossible crush on a struggling single father. Today, she was a woman who had chosen to build her life around love rather than ambition, community rather than opportunity. It was, she thought as David pulled into the driveway of what was now their shared home, exactly the right choice. Some promises she had learned were worth keeping no matter how long they took to fulfill.